being admitted into this afternoon's event. So I'll just allow a couple of moments for our team to continue to admit people in, but I'll get us started while that happens. Welcome to the Rights of Children with Disabilities, Australia's Double Failure. My name is Natalie Wade, and I'm the Vice President of Australian Lawyers for Human Rights. I would like to begin by acknowledging and paying my respects to our First Nations people, past, present, and emerging, and particularly acknowledge any First Nations people with us today. I am streaming to you from the land of the Kaurna people in South Australia. So today's webinar is the 12th in a series which is developing greater knowledge and understanding of the Convention on the Rights of the Child and other UN human rights treaties. Australia reported to the UN committees on the rights of the child and the rights of persons with disabilities during the second half of 2019. Both committees highlighted concerns about the rights of children with disabilities and made recommendations relevant to the Commonwealth and State governments. The recommendations reflected the intersectionality between the Convention on the Rights of the Child and the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. Today, we will hear from two esteemed speakers in Rosemary Kayess, the chair of the CRPD Committee, and also from Julie Charlton, our youth representative, who will speak to us about these important topics. Before we get started, I would just have a couple of housekeeping matters. One is to let you know that today will be recorded. So if you prefer, turn off your camera if you don't want that to be happening. I would also ask that you stay on silent or mute if you're not speaking, just so we don't get too many barking dogs and postal deliveries in the background. If you have any questions or comments, you should provide them in the chat. If you're not able to do so for access reasons, or you would prefer to speak orally, then you can raise your hand, your electronic Zoom hand, and we will come to you when we can throughout the conversation. I'm also instructed to let you know that there will be links provided to websites and documents that are referred to throughout today's presentations. They will be put in the chat so that you can have a look and follow along as they're mentioned. So it is my absolute honour to introduce today Rosemary Chase. Rosemary will be known to everyone here, I'm sure. She is a formidable leader of the disability rights movement in Australia. She's also a senior lecturer at UNSW's Faculty of Law and currently is the chair on the rights of persons with disabilities. Today, Rosemary will engage with the committee's concerns, namely Australia's double failure on the children's rights and rights of persons with a disability, including the lack of adequate national planning to protect the rights of children and with disabilities, the use of medication to control behaviour, forced sterilisation, discrimination in schools, detention and restraint of children with disabilities, inadequacies in the National Disability Insurance Scheme, the detention of children of asylum seekers with disabilities, and the continuing removal from their families of Indigenous children with disabilities. So just a few small topics, it would seem. So without any further ado, please welcome Rosemary Kayess.
Thank you very much, Natalie, for the warm welcome, and thank you to the Diplomacy Training Program for the invitation to be part of this webinar series. Today, I'd like to acknowledge that I'm speaking to you from Bidjigal land, and I'd like to pay my respects to Elders past, present and emerging. I'd also like to take the opportunity to acknowledge the land of my ancestors, the Dharawal and the Darug peoples. This is Aboriginal land. It always has been, it always will be. So today we're discussing the intersection between the Convention on the Rights of the Child, the CRC, and the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, the CRPD. However, from the outset, it's important to emphasise that the rights of children with disability are just as relevant within all core human rights treaties. This allows the human rights framework to be responsive to the circumstances and diversity of children with disability, including girls with disability, children with intersex variations, First Nations children, children in vulnerable situations, children in the criminal justice system, migrant children, those without parental care, children in street situations, child victims of trafficking, those affected by climate change, and children at risk of or experiencing all forms of violence, including sexual gender-based violence. Sorry, I just had my scrolling a little bit confused. The concluding observations from the various human rights treaties bodies are highly likely to address children's rights issues, and these issues need to be understood as inclusive of children with disability. Nevertheless, the CRC is the thematic treaty that applies human rights in the context of children, and the CRPD is the thematic treaty that applies human rights in the context of disability, including children with disability. The CRPD is the first human rights treaty to explicitly and comprehensively address intersectional discrimination, recognising the multidimensional layers of identities and statuses and life realities that interact with each other at the same time in such a way as to be inseparable. In relation to age, the CRPD contains a cross-cutting article, Article 7, on children with disability, that requires states parties to address the specific issues of children and to take age-appropriate measures to facilitate the realisation of all the substantive rights of the CRPD. Article 7 harmonises the legal standards of the CRC with the CRPD. The CRC and the CRPD are both applied to children with disability, but the CRPD is the specialist treaty with regard to children with disability. This means that the interpretation and implementation of the CRC for children with disability requires a solid understanding of the standards and principles of the CRPD, so that law reform, policy development, and advocacy is inclusive and responsive to the human rights issues concerning children with disability. These human rights concerns need to be part of and driven by children's rights advocates as much as disability rights advocates. For example, it was disability advocates that worked with children's rights advocates to include the issue of forced sterilisation of girls with disabilities, among other issues, in the Shadow Report for the 2005 review of Australia Disability advocates also included the issue of forced sterilisation of women and girls in the shadow report for the 2006 review of Australia under the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, CEDAW. Following ratification of CRPD in 2008, disability advocates have included the issue of forced sterilisation in CRPD shadow reports, as well as continuing to include this issue in the shadow reports for CRC, CEDAW, as well as for ICCPR, ICHESCA and CAT. And the shadow reports for the Human Rights Council Universal Periodic Review of Australia for 2011, 2015 and 2021. Consequently, we now have numerous recommendations to Australia from several treaty bodies and the Human Rights Council for Australia to prohibit the forced sterilisation of people with disability. Disability advocates have demonstrated the power of taking an intersectional approach to the rights of children with disability. Human rights advocacy for children with disability is only strengthened when child rights advocates effectively respond to intersectional issues. The intersection between CRC and CRPD was clearly apparent in 2019 when Australia was reviewed by both the Committee on the Rights of the Child and the Committee on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. The concluding observations from both committees largely reflect human rights concerns in common about the specific situation of children with disability in Australia. They reflect a reality for children with disability that is based on a medical model, deficit view of disability. Disability has for a long time been understood as an individual deficit, an individual problem to be overcome or cured, or to be suffered. This conflicts with the universal ideals we have of humanness. The view of disability as an individual deficit has been a powerful and enduring influence on the social conceptualisation of disability throughout modern history. It has guided and dominated health, social care and children's policy, with the resulting assumptions that both problems and solutions lie within children with disability rather than within society. People with disability are viewed as abnormal, outside the norm, an exception to humanness. And this view is at the core of the devaluing of people with disability as inferior and other. This is ableism. Impairment, or as it's more commonly referred to, disability, has long been an exception for the application of human rights and fundamental freedoms, with rights being denied or diminished on the basis of impairment. This denial and diminishment of rights is often seen as benevolent, protective, and necessary because of the ableist perception that reduces children with disability to objects of care, treatment, and protection. It results in children with disability being separated from their family, other children and society by being placed in special schools, special residential facilities, including group homes, and placed on pathways to segregated employment. This segregation of children with disability has become the norm in our society, and it reinforces the devaluing of people with disability and perpetuates the low expectations for their full and effective participation and inclusion in society. So it's not surprising that the concluding observations from both the CRC and the CRPD identify human rights concerns in common. We have in Australia an education system where locking children in disability purpose-built cages is problem solving. Justice systems where children with cognitive differences can be indefinitely detained without conviction. Health systems where children with disability die from lack of primary health care. And protection systems that authorise medical interventions, including sterilisation of children with disability in the absence of serious threats to life or health. A migration system that condones the indefinite detention of refugee and asylum seeker children with disability. And a child protection system that removes First Nation children with disability from their families, community, and country. It's quite clear that there needs to be a social transformation with children with disability so that their rights are realised. The CRPD reaffirms that all children with disability should be able to exercise and enjoy all human rights and fundamental freedoms on an equal basis with other children. The principles and standards contained in the CRPD need to be understood by states parties and human rights defenders, with an onus on states parties to implement these principles and standards in law, policy and practice. The CRPD reaffirms that children with disability are equal members of the human family. Its role is to ensure that the universal standard of human dignity and worth is respected and applied to children with disability in law, policy and practice. The CRPD clearly establishes and reinforces that children with disability are rights holders, where impairment is just one aspect of human diversity. And as such, impairment cannot be the basis for the denial or limitation of human rights. The CRPD challenges the prevailing view that children with disability as inherently vulnerable due to their individual deficits. And hence children with disability require care, treatment and protection within a social welfare framework as a way of dealing with what is perceived as special needs. The CRPD explicitly attaches the universal standard of human dignity to impairment through the lens of the CRPD and its human rights approach. We can fully understand that the denial or diminishment on the basis of impairment fails to meet international norms of human rights. Law and policy regimes based on care, treatment and protection, such as special schools, segregated employment pathways, indefinite detention without conviction in the criminal justice system, child removal on the basis of impairment, and forced medical interventions are no longer acceptable. Currently in Australia, law, policy and practice is about facilitating segregation and limitations to human rights for children with disability, whereas the great transformation and innovation should be about law, policy and practice, enabling the exercise of human rights. This is the task Australia has before it, to implement the standards and principles of the CRC and CRPD so that the human rights of children with disability can be respected, protected and fulfilled. This shift requires legal policy and program responses with core values of inclusion, elimination of individual and structural discrimination, and removal of all barriers to full participation in all aspects of our society. To achieve this, we need not just reformation, but transformation of our society. It is not enough, never enough, just to reform systems and practices so that the old care, treatment and protection systems are enhanced or closer to the human rights standard. We must transform systems and practices through centering human rights and human diversity. This will not be easy or quick. It will require confronting established systems and ways of thinking. It will require challenging the associated vested interests. It will require us to expect and to participate in planning the transition from these outdated systems and understandings of disability to transform our society to one where children with disability are genuinely equal members of society. Thank you.
Wow, thank you so much, Rosemary, for that just incredibly centering address today. That was just really, we don't talk enough about the impact of law and policy in the potential to respect and fulfill people's human rights, but also in the converse, the impact it has in diminishing those rights. So thank you for bringing us back to base on that. Our next speaker is also a leader of the disability rights movement here in Australia, Julie Charlton. Julie is a 22-year-old advocate for the rights of people with disabilities and an elite para-athlete and coach who advocates for fair sporting policies and procedures. Julie, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me. Firstly, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Julie Charlton. I am 22 years old and I am a young person living with spina bifida. I would like to acknowledge that I am currently working on Darug land, and I'd like to pay my respects to all elders past, present and emerging, and to acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded. So my elevator pitch of who I am, what my passions are, what my goals are that I'm a youth ambassador. I am an elite para-athlete in the field of athletics. I also coach in the field of seated throws, and I am currently working with Children and Young People with a Disability Australia in their Youth Advisory Council, where I get to live my absolute dream of supporting children and young people to speak about their lived experience and take that direct experience to the decision makers who will help shape the future of young people with a disability. I want to sincerely thank the Diplomacy Training Program, the Youth Law Australia and the Australian Lawyers for Human Rights for facilitating today, and for particularly giving a platform for young people with a disability to speak about their lived experience and how Australia and the experience of living in Australia with a disability has affected young people. The other day, I was asked a very specific question of what does the Convention of the Rights of People with a Disability mean to me? And to be honest, I, in a general sense, would have never said I would think about it in my general life ever. But for me, thinking about it specifically, it means that my rights as a person with a disability at some point in history have been held to an international standard to mean that my rights matter. They were taken into consideration, and that there is a very clear baseline of what I should expect society to uphold to protect my rights. At a very young age, I knew that my rights were not being upheld properly, as in comparison to the general population. I started working in advocacy when I was 7. I was Northcote Disability Services' first Spina Bifida Awareness Week ambassador. Of course, at 7 years old, I had no idea what this meant or what it would mean to me at the time, but the opportunity to raise awareness about my disability, about the barriers to equality, but also how society could treat me as an equal. It not only started my passion for advocacy, but it also related to, as you all know, Article 8 of the CRPD, which is awareness raising. Seemingly becoming an article that would follow me in every single career I would have following that, such as the Don't Diss My Ability campaign, my work with the Office for New South Wales Advocate for Children and Young People, and my sporting advocacy. I was able to talk about my disability to raise awareness, but also help society understand more about accessibility in all areas. And that provided me with a sense of disability pride, which a lot of young people with a disability are not fostered to have. Through every opportunity that I've had, I've tried to make my absolute best to make sure that young people with a disability are not only seen, but heard, listened to, and involved in the conversations that are making a difference to their lives. Young people with a disability are often left out of the conversations that relate to their lives and are rarely consulted on their experiences of how society can improve. At my role at the Children and Young People with a Disability Australia, I have the absolute honour to speak with young people, facilitate these exact conversations about their lived experiences, and take them to the decision makers that can help make a change. 2 of the outlets that allow me to do so are the Livedx Consultations and the National Disability Youth Summit. So in 2020, we had the opportunity to hold the very first National Disability Youth Summit, which was held, designed by, created for, and facilitated by young people with a disability, with the support of Children and Young People with a Disability Australia. This platform allowed for young people with a disability from across the country to come together virtually to discuss their lived experiences on a range of topics such as employment, discrimination, education, and so many more. This year at CIDA, we also had a series of focus groups, aptly named Livedx, which means lived experience, where we consulted young disabled people about their lived experience and the purpose to give feedback directly to decision makers. These conversations highlighted just how disillusioned young people are with the government and with society's ability to uphold the basic human rights that are stated to be awarded to young disabled people, but are very clearly ignored. One young person stated in one of our inclusion consultations that inclusion meant to them that it meant that they were being respected and represented without engaging in harmful stereotypes. The word utopian was used and came up as a reoccurring motif in so many consultations when asking young people what they would like to see as the future when discussing accessible and inclusive society. Utopian should not have to be a word used to have basic equal human rights. To me, that clearly shows that the Australian public, illustrated by the Australian government, a lack of implementation of the CRPD, and that has severely impacted the young people of Australia who live with disabilities to be able to feel accepted as a member of the general Australian public. The consultations highlighted a need for more education and enforcement of the CRPD, because if given the chance, I could most definitely give you a very, very, very long list of experiences from young people where their rights were certainly not upheld. Almost relating to every single article within the convention. I, for one, could give you a very long list about where my rights were not treated fairly within education, leading me to have to advocate for inclusive education through the Australian Coalition for Inclusive Education, where we fight, advocate for, and actively work towards making an inclusive society for young people with a disability. Young people, again, if given the opportunity, can have an opportunity to make decisions for themselves and provide an insight into a long ignored part of society. The webinar's name, Australia's Double Failure, I believe is a perfect encapsulation of the opinions of young people with disabilities, that Australia has failed to appropriately protect them and their rights. Again, thank you so much for creating this platform for the voices of young people with disabilities to be heard, and for myself to express the importance of having these experiences at the forefront of these types of conversations. Thank you again, and it's been a pleasure speaking with you.
Thank you so much, Julie. That was incredibly, I think, eye-opening for many of our audience today. I think you really hit the nail on the head when you said that utopian should not be a word that we use when we're talking about the basic equal human rights of children and young people with disabilities. It's absolutely spot on, and your reflections on the understanding and recognition of the Australian public, illustrated through the Australian government in their fundamental lack of understanding of inclusion of people with disabilities, is more important today than ever before. So thank you for those very wise words. I also must say that I'm completely in awe that you identify the start of your advocacy career at age 7. My gosh, I'm sure that that's definitely not what I was doing at age 7. So that you'll be at retirement age by the time you're 30. Oh my gosh. Now we have an opportunity for questions. While you all open the chat box and start to put in the hard questions for both Rosemary and Julie, I just wanted to take a brief moment to really acknowledge the exceptional work of both of our speakers today in advancing the rights of people with disabilities in Australia. It is often said that when we talk about human rights movements, and particularly in the context of disability rights, that it can all be very utopian, in the words of the young people. But I know, certainly from the work of Rosemary and Julie in particular, that their work has a tangible, practical outcome for the lived experience of people with disabilities. And without their advocacy, we would not see the progression that we have seen in Australia to date. So thank you both for your individual efforts, which I know take up a lot of hours and time and energy. So thank you. I'm just checking the chat. While people continue to have a moment, I have some questions that I personally, I was about to like, I prepared them. I did not prepare them. But the good people at the diplomacy training program, they did prepare them for us. And I think one of them is something that we are all perhaps wondering. So, the Convention on the Rights of the Child places an obligation on state parties to listen to and hear the voices of children and young people with disabilities. What are young people doing to ensure their voices are being heard? Julie, can I start with you?
Most definitely, Julie speaking. We as young people are actually doing a lot. Children and Young People with a Disability Australia provide an amazing platform for young people who are already interested in advocacy to be able to stand up for themselves and make a difference through just talking about their general lived experience. As I said in my speech, we have held 9 different consultations across the year, where we got to speak about so many different intersectional issues that come together with disability, and we are trying to put those together to make a report to go directly to those decision makers that go with those topics. So some of those ones included our education standards, our employment standards. We had a recent one about the LGBTQIA+ community and how that intersects with disability and how that lived experience truly affects those young people. But these days, more and more I see young people stepping up into levels of politics, power, just taking a very real interest in their future. In the able-bodied space, we've seen young people step up to fight for climate change and for more systemic change in our world, and people with a disability are doing exactly the same. It's just we don't get publicised as much, and that's going to change very, very soon, because the work that we are doing is very powerful, and I believe it's going to make a real difference.
Amazing. Thank you for sharing that back-end information with us. It's what we need to know, absolutely. Rosemary, did you have any views on that?
Look, there's been some really powerful things that children and young people have been doing, but I've had the pleasure and the honour to lead a couple of delegations, one in particular, a youth delegation to the UN for the Conference of States Parties. It's, you know, a commitment to building leaders of the next generation, which is incredibly important. And it's an area that the child rights area could do well to look at and to emulate, to be able to bring in a diverse range of children, including children with disability, to develop their skills and their knowledge around international advocacy and international law. But the CRPD takes the CRC position of hearing the voice of children with, children being heard, and places it in a much more structural, embedded way within the convention. So Article 7, it's cross-cutting application. The obligations, there's an obligation under general obligations to closely consult with people with disability through their representative organisations. And then within political participation and Article 30 and 33, where implementation and monitoring of the convention should closely consult with people with disability and their representative organisations. So there's very structural obligations on states to consult with and work with and have people with disability as active participants, including children and youth with disability. And so it's about supporting those organisations of children and young people with disability that operate to be a representative voice for children and young people with disabilities. So, from supporting peer networks to supporting organisations such as CIDA.
Thank you so much. And there's a few follow-up questions on the how of youth engagement in the chat, and we're going to come to those in a minute. But before we do, I just wanted to go to Maria Shank. I probably completely botched that, but Maria, what would you like to ask our speakers today? Just you're just on mute there.
Thank you very much, Natalie, and don't worry about the surname. There is a very, very small pool of people who have said that. Correct.
Sorry, I'm not sure if that was just my internet, Maria, but I've just...
I'm so sorry.
No, you're completely fine.
I was holding down the space bar, but it didn't seem to
Oh yes, that is a Zoom myth, I believe, the space bar trick.
Right.
In 2 years of a pandemic, I've never quite got it right. So would you like to just try again?
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
What do you think comes first? Societal transformation or policy transformation? Or must they fundamentally be concurrent for either to be extant?
Fantastic question. Rosemary, can we start with you?
Well, theories of change will tell you that they all work in a symbiotic relationship. So you'll get people's action change because of legislative change, but you also get legislative change because people's knowledge and understanding will change and they will be expecting different things. So yes, they should occur a bit concurrently, but they will have a cyclical relationship. So if you have leadership in an area that's being driven by the expertise of people with disability, you will be able to see that if you get policy change, you will get change within the general attitudes of the community. And so it's because we reinforce negative attitudes of people with disability and children with disability, especially through segregated education and pathways to segregated employment, that low expectations are just reinforced through the structure of our society. The fact that we continue to have group homes and residential living for people with disability, again, reinforces these low expectations that obviously people with disability can't live in the community. They need all these special things, all this, very specialised support. And so those low expectations get reinforced time and time again. And so it's very important that you have both the structural change as well as the change within the community. And so much of that will be driven by people with disability being in the community and being active within the community and engaging more broadly with the general population.
Thanks, Rosemary. It's so true. Julie, in your experience, which comes first? Or, as Rosemary says, are they needed together?
I just want to apologise. I didn't get the question. My internet was going a bit glitchy.
So the question is, when we have societal change versus policy and legal change, which leads which? Do you need the law and policies to change first, or do you need society to change first? So Rosemary's just said, well, they sort of happen concurrently. that you need them both to work in tandem together?
Wonderful, thank you so much. I would say that you can't have policy change without some kind of societal change, because to have the idea to even change the policy, something has to change in the mindset of society or those changing the policy. So yes, it has to work in tandem, but I do believe that something in society does need to improve first in order for that change to even be thought of. So, because we have worked together, Maria, the change and the ideas that we as young people come up with speak towards the changes that we are hoping to make in the future. And without our input, those ideas either won't come at all or will take longer to get there, because that societal input is not being had. So that's why it kind of needs to come first, in my opinion.
Thank you, Julie. I would like to read out a question from Susan McGowan, and then we'll move to Kasia, and then we'll move to Cheryl, if that's okay. So Susan has asked in the chat, what do we need to do to accelerate the realisation of rights for young people with disability? In Susan's experience, decision makers like to celebrate the small incremental changes at the expense of making real and meaningful change. The concept of going on journey towards the realisation of rights seems unacceptably slow. Rosemary, would you be able to share your thoughts?
Look, I can't disagree with Susan's perspective on this. Australia has some great policy, but we don't get behind, solid plans. We don't have a lot of planning for the future with a goal of reform at the end of it. We do a lot of policy tinkering around the edges. And then when we do try to do some planning, we do things like the National Disability Strategy. Well, it's got a lot of strategy, but it's got no leverage and it's had no action and implementation. Various reviews that have been done around the National Disability Strategy leading up to this new National Disability Strategy has identified that it doesn't have, hasn't had the impact that it should have had. It hasn't had the leverage with the states. It hasn't been able to get action when action needs to be taken. And it tends to go for low-hanging fruit. It didn't at any point truly try and address some of the big ticket items, such as special education, dealing with congregate care. And we saw what the problems for that, they were writ large during, they've been writ large during the pandemic. The lack of support that parents were given for kids with disability trying to learn at home. The fact that the high risk groups of people with disability were living in congregate situations, and if they weren't just at extremely high risk of contracting COVID and the health implications for that, they were at high risk of having their rights violated in terms of over excessive restrictions on their movements above and beyond what the general community was experiencing. So no access to people from the outside world, limited movement from their rooms sometimes in 24-hour periods, and even new classifications of guardianship restrictions that would stop people having the same rights as other people did to leave their house. So yeah, we don't have a plan of action for employment for people with disability. We don't have a solid plan for dismantling special education. So, and this was one of the things that the CRPD Committee really targeted in on, is that, you know, we've made a massive social welfare change like the NDIS, but we haven't supported it with the inclusive policy framework that will make sure that that signature piece of the NDIS is successful. And that really the committee was asking the same questions of Australia in 2019 that it was asking Australia in 2013. So we either had plans that we haven't invigorated, or we don't have any plans that have good, concreted, resourced steps to be taken to address major policy areas.
Thanks so much, Rosemary. I'm mindful of time. Julie, did you have a comment around the acceleration of human rights here in Australia for people with disabilities?
I think, oh, everything is frozen. I'm just going to wait for it to come back. There we go. Sorry, my screen froze. I'm always disappointed about how slowly things change in terms of human rights. But with disability, I heard this really fantastic quote the other day. He was talking about how the NDIS, it isn't a welfare system, it is an essential infrastructure or correction of social responsibility, or ensuring that all Australians get choice and control and access into their community. That it is pretty much fulfilling a human contract with our community. That human contract with our community should not take this long to be able to get basic human rights. And that is something that I'm disappointed in, but I know from working in advocacy and in local government, it will still take a very long time to do so. So we just keep working towards, yes, grabbing those little low-hanging fruits of those small wins, but those small wins eventually will work towards a bigger win. It's frustrating, but for me it is worth it because I can see the progress that is happening for young people with disabilities.
Thanks so much. I think we have time for just one more question. And to show you are on my screen with your hand up, so apologies in advance for not getting to everyone, but to show your question.
Yeah. Hi. Rosemary, you were talking there about leverage. I love that word. We've got these strategies and policies. It's not just us. So many countries have lovely strategies and policies. But what do you think it is that can, maybe you've seen experiences of this or in other countries or on certain situations, but what is it that might be able to hit that leverage, you know, get us a little bit further up? Is it demonstration of financial benefits of having people with disability educated? Or I don't know. What do you, have you seen anything or do you have ideas there?
Hi, Cashel, it's good to see you. Looking very festive in the background there. Look, the leverage I was referring to was leverage to get states to act. They used to have a lot more influence on the states in terms of state of action when there was still the grant system around the transfer of federal funds into the state funds for disability services. With the NDIS, that has changed that. Their ability to leverage and negotiate those leverages through the Commonwealth State disability agreements. But I understand what you mean. Yes, you need to be able to kickstart the change, because a lot of the change needs to happen in the private sector as much as it needs to happen within government and leveraging that. I think it's about trying to embrace the human rights approach, have a commitment to it. And if we had leadership around it, you would probably get better uptake. I mean, business and private sector is generally pretty good at picking up these things. They do so much better on the treatment of women in, I mean, look at the difference between major firms these days and Parliament. It's been, you know, demonstrated quite strikingly that if business sees the common sense of something, then they will follow it. And I think the greater participation and the recognition of diversity is being shown, even through the pandemic, that a lot of it's about engaging with people individually and seeing what needs they require, regardless of whether there's a diagnosed impairment or not. Flexibility has been the word for employment over the last 18 months, 2 years. And so I think leverage is about trying to get everybody to understand that none of us have the full repertoire of skills that's required for life, and that we will all have varying levels of abilities at certain points in our lives. You know, at sometimes more, at other times less. So I think the leverage is about being real about who we are as a community and moving away from the idealized norm of some bloke generally that's, you know, quite able-bodied, so, and sound of mind, and, you know, all the other terminologies that go with this person that is an illusion as the normal individual. And our society is much more diverse than that. We've got so many layers of identities, and once we can embrace that as a society, then we can work towards having the structures that meet the needs of that diversity. But until we recognise that there is no norm, and that anybody that doesn't match up to that norm is abnormal and needs something special, we're not going to be able to move beyond it. Sorry,
No,
don't have the magic pill.
Thank you, Rosemary. And
It's supposed to be so amazing. Where's this magic pill? Come on.
that's right. We're at time, but I'd really like to finish with Julie's thoughts on leverage and any other matters that you wanted to share with us, Julie. I think it's appropriate entirely that our young person representative have the last say today. So over to you.
There we go. For me, come on screen. Leverage means that young people are listened to, that their stories are taken into account, and then are implemented to make changes and improvements. So for the topic of employment, we have so many lived experiences from young people who talk about it, that if their lived experience of their very, and then at least made in incremental little changes to make it as inclusive as possible over time, that allows the beginning of leverage for young people in employment to occur. For me, being in a wheelchair would just mean that I need an accessible space where I can fit my my regular manual wheelchair, that I would need breaks for my back, and that is taken into consideration over a work day. I think if that is listened to and then taken into consideration to put into employment policy, where it allows any person to have the accommodations that will fit them to be able to do the best work possible and to give their 100%, because everybody's going to have a different 100% for them. No able-bodied person has the same 100%, let alone a disabled person. And so really understanding that everybody is different, everybody has their own abilities, everyone has their own disadvantages, putting that all together to make the most inclusive workplace possible will allow for leverage to happen on all different levels, but particularly for young people with disability who are starting out in employment.
Thank you so much, Julie. And thank you again, Rosemary, for your astute and absolute leadership in this entire space. Thank you to everyone who has come today and spent time out of what is a very busy time of year to learn about these really important and crucial topics to the advancement of the rights of children and young people in Australia, particularly those living with disability. This webinar series will continue throughout 2022 and will include face-to-face workshops. So the details of those will be available in the new year. So please keep an eye out of those. And if you're able to, please come along to any of the webinars to ensure that you're getting across the current thinking in human rights law and practice here in Australia. Thank you again, everyone, and have a great day.
Thank you.